Welcome, everybody, to the first in our series of Monday lunchtime speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. In 1904, the muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens published a book called The Shame of the Cities, a survey of the rampant corruption, the backroom dealing, and the sheer incompetence of the mayors and other politicians running America's largest cities and often running them into the ground. The chapter on Philadelphia was christened with the unforgettable title, Philadelphia, Corrupt and Contented. If Philadelphia is less corrupt today than it was a century ago, much of the credit goes to the Committee of 70, founded, no coincidence, in 1904. For over 100 years, the committee has been working to promote ethical, effective, and genuinely representative government in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. To give a few examples, because of their efforts, elected officials can no longer accept cash gifts, duh. Campaign contributions have been strictly limited, double duh. And excessive pension bonuses have been banned. Much has been done, much is left to do. Pat Christmas is one of those doers. Before joining the Committee of 70 in 2013, Pat taught high school biology and forensic science. He serves as the committee's policy director. He is responsible for managing 70's policy projects and advocacy campaigns, and he supports its civic programming, communications, and social media. It is a pleasure to welcome Pat, who will open our Vote That Jawn speaker series discussing organizing and advocacy. Vote That Jawn.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter, for that very generous introduction. My name is Pat Christmas. I'm so happy to be here and to kick off the series with the topic of organizing and advocacy. So, we only have this lunchtime period to talk about this big topic. So we'll try to keep this as focused as we can. Beginning with what the basics are. I mean, organizing advocacy. What is that? To advocate. In short, to advocate is to speak for, to work for, to fight for changes, or sometimes to speak against, or to fight against certain changes, or to fight against the status quo. If there's a thing or two that we can take out of this lunchtime discussion, I really want it to be our ability to try to see where the power is. Power is a word that really doesn't get used often enough in plain language. It's simply the means to make someone else or other people do something differently, to do as you would have them do. And when we're talking about organizing and advocacy, usually what we're talking about is making people in government do something different. So the question is, who are the decision makers, and more critically, who are those critical decision makers who have actual power to make a change? And secondly, once you get there, what are those specific changes you want to see? So, Peter, again, very generously gave the Committee of 70 an awful lot of credit for being around for a long time, established during the progressive era in the early 20th century to push back against what was at the time a very powerful Republican machine. And we've been around ever since with a pretty standard good government agenda. But one of the things that has to be acknowledged at the outset is that 70 has been around all this time and has done a lot of good work, but throughout that history in collaboration with a lot of other groups, and in particular, groups that are grassroots and groups that are driven by real people, real citizens, real voters. Because without that sort of broad-based pressure from the electorate, from real people in real neighborhoods, real change doesn't happen. So I figured we'd talk about just a couple examples here of where at least I've seen this work in pretty interesting ways. And one of those is actually with a community park down in South Philadelphia. So I volunteer with a community-based organization called CMAC. CMAC was established during the 1970s with folks fleeing East Asia from war. And this group has for at least the initial part of its history, focused on immigrants and refugees from Eastern and Southeast Asia. But today services groups and people of all sorts, and they're mostly based in South Philly. And there's a park in South Philadelphia, Mifflin Square Park, which for many years had been overrun. I mean, there's crime and drug use. The folks of the community, families, children, couldn't feel safe playing there. And so the question was, how can we take the park back over? And so because CMAC is a community-based organization and led by community leaders, community activists, they knew that they had to build power. And this began, not with speaking with grass tops, organizations like the Committee of 70 or going straight to the mayor. It began with talking with people in the neighborhood. And also because South Philadelphia is a particularly diverse part of Philly. Again, there's folks from Eastern and Southeastern Asia, Central and South America. There are longtime Black residents, longtime white residents, newer, youngish white residents who've just moved in. There are a lot of different folks there. And the challenge was, and the opportunity was, to bring all these different groups together and start talking about what they see for the park. What sort of vision do they want for this beautiful park that's right in the middle of South Philadelphia? So they held a whole number of community meetings. And I attended a couple of these, and they were miraculous because there were 4 or 5 or 6 different languages in the room, and they had to have interpreters to help people talk to each other. And what they were doing was not only talking about the park itself and the vision, and specifically, the plans. Where should a ball field go? Where should the basketball court go? Where should a bench go? But what was the shared vision for the park? And in doing this, they were building power within the community and between folks who live right next to each other, but previously hadn't had much of a relationship. So in doing this, they started to build power amongst the folks in the community. This then attracted private funding. That's another source of power out there, which is wealth. And millions, $1 or $2 million came in to help plan further. And what has happened now is that because the leaders down there have recognized that they had to build this community around a vision for the park, they had to secure some amount of private funding for planning further for what they want this park to be. They also knew that at the end of the day, government has to step in and provide more funding and provide certain changes in rules. So in the city of Philadelphia, right, this is when the basics from our textbooks start coming into play. We have branches of government. So in the city of Philadelphia, we have an executive branch, the mayor, right, and we have a legislative branch, city council. And in Philadelphia, our city council has 17 members. Now, 7 of these members are at large. They represent the whole city. And 10 of them are they're district members. And so there is a district member in South Philadelphia, Mark Squilla. He represents the 1st district. And the reason we have these district members is so that these particular council members can keep front and center concerns within a particular geographic area. That's their job. The at-large members, their job mostly is to step back, look at the whole city, and figure out what sort of policy changes, what sort of funding might we need to keep in mind for the city as a whole. But district members look locally. And also, because they have this local focus, they have a tremendous amount of power over development. What happens to a park? What happens to an old building that's been around for too long, or for a big development that wants to get created? And because this district council member has been there, we know that we wanted to make bigger changes from this park than we can afford with just our own hands and with a little bit of private funding. We knew that we had to get this district council member on board. So what has happened over the course of several years, actually, is that this council member and all these other groups have been involved in these conversations about the future of the park. And so at this point, there is a program in the city of Philadelphia called Rebuild. There are millions of dollars that are in this program, actually, and in part funded by the soda tax that was implemented by city council a few years ago. And what will hopefully happen in the next year or two is that the district council member will be a champion through the Rebuild project to bring more money into this park and finally build it out into the rest of the vision that the community wanted. So what happened was, the whole point of that story was, it has taken several years. It actually may take more than several years at the end of the day, but it'll be worth it, to have connected all these different people across different communities, but all centered around this park, to bring in initial funding, to start building up relationships, and then critically bringing in a local official and elected official who would then have the decision-making power to bring in the rest of the funding to make this park happen. So this was a particularly big project, and it was a more thorough project than perhaps others that have come together. And part of that is because the folks who were organizing initially, community organizers who wanted to advocate on behalf of the people who live there and this new park, they knew they had to build relationships and build power first at the very beginning of this thing before they could get to the council member. So, a way to go about this that probably would not have been quite as productive would have been for, a few people who live nearby the park who thought, I'd like to see a lot more investment here. I'd like to see this park look differently. So why don't we go have a meeting with a council member, and then he or she will do whatever we say, whatever we tell them. That didn't happen, and even if it had, nothing would have come of it, right? Because there was no power there. Just a few people going to meet with a council member. That can be productive, especially to ask questions, share concerns. But really, to make big, lasting change, there has to be some underlying power there, and it has to come from numbers. So that's one local example, right? Just here in Philadelphia, about how building local power and knowing who has decision-making authority, whether it's from private funders to bring in some initial money, and then ultimately with government, how that would get done. So that's one local example. Another I would raise is with elections, and that's what I spend a lot of my time working on. And as you probably know, we just had a big election this past June 2nd was our presidential primary. And we have very unusual and extraordinary conditions to run an election under, right? Because of the COVID-19 crisis. It's not as safe as it used to be. In fact, it's much less safe to go to in person to a polling place. And so a significant challenge and need is to maximize the number of people who vote by mail. So Pennsylvania, unfortunately, has very, very old election law. It goes back to 1937, and we haven't made too many changes at all in that election code. And in most states, that's where election rules are set at the state level. So again, here, we'll just back up for a quick second. We have to take a look and see where decision-making power is. So if I'm an advocate for the Committee of 70, we're working to make changes in the election code, election rules, and election administration, I need to know where the decision-making authority is. So in Pennsylvania, like it is in most states, it starts with state election law. And at the state level, we have branches as well, right? Just the local level, just like at the federal level. So at the state level, we have an executive branch led by the governor. We have a legislative branch, that's the General Assembly, and it's bicameral, just like the US Congress is. So there's a Senate with 50 members, and there's a House with 203 members. And then we have a judicial branch as well. But as far as election reform goes, often that starts with the legislative branch. So that's where a lot of the activity amongst all the advocates has been for several years now, to advocate for changes in election law. And very fortunately, we were able to get through, and when I say me, we, not me, but we, that is very much dozens and dozens of organizations from across the state working with local and state officials to get an election reform package passed. And this was accomplished just in October of last year. And there were a whole bunch of changes in this election reform package. And part of the reason it came together was for partisan political reasons, that's the way these big things come together sometimes. But critically within this election reform package was the provision for any Pennsylvanian to vote by mail. This is something that the Committee of 70 has advocated for many years, and pretty much any other voting rights advocate in the state of Pennsylvania has for a long time, forever, advocated for allowing any voter for any reason to vote by mail. And this is previous to this, you had to have a very specific reason. You had to be outside of a municipality, you had to be sick, had to be above 65 or disabled. It was a much more limited set of reasons you could vote by mail. And we had no idea that when this election reform package came together last year, that the vote by mail piece would have been all the more essential with the outbreak of COVID earlier in 2020. Right. So this was just last year, where all advocates had been working mostly just at the state level within the General Assembly, because that's the body that passes the bills, right? And then the governor has to sign them. To get that initial bit done. So what has happened since is, again, we've had to keep our mind on who has decision-making power and authority here. So in Pennsylvania, after we pass, in this case, state election law, the next level of decision-making authority is the Department of State. So we have a U.S. Department of State as well, right? That has foreign relations and international relations duties that are top of mind for it. Here in the Pennsylvania, we don't do foreign relations, but we have a whole number of other duties for our Pennsylvania Department of State, and one of them is elections. And what happened after we passed the state election law is the Department of State had to then produce guidance for the counties as to how to implement that election law. And this is where things can get more complicated, but we have 67 counties across Pennsylvania, 67 local governments. And after the state passes its election law, the Pennsylvania Department of State issues this guidance. Then these 67 counties take into account when they actually execute elections. So what the advocates had to do was shift their attention from the General Assembly and the governor in passing a law to the Department of State and trying to provide feedback and shape the guidance that would be issued out to the counties. And then after that bit was done, it was down to the local level where, I can't stress enough, especially since the Committee of 70 is a local and state advocate for good government reform. Local government is where a lot of the action is at. And as whether it's elections or policing or education or healthcare, infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, so much of our daily lives happens at the local level. And frankly, at the point we're at now, the General Assembly, our legislature, will probably make a few other changes, hopefully very critical changes in our election law before the November 2020 general election. But a lot of the game will now be at the local level with our counties. So in Philadelphia, which is both a city and a county, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of discussion right now, a lot of advocacy around our 3 city commissioners who run elections to try to get them to do some things differently. This is also happening in other counties around the state. So some of those things include, for example, and these are the things that if you're not voting yet, I'm sure you will soon. I'm sure you are making certain that everybody in your household is voting, that everybody who possibly can votes by mail. That's the safest and most secure way to vote right now. And then to make sure, so we're going to make sure that that ability is widely open as possible. That for example, if apply online, those applications get processed accurately. If you submit a paper application, that you'll get postage to get your application back. And then also once you do get your mail-in ballot, I'm sure we will have tens of thousands of people who will have their mail-in ballots. They'll have a way to get them in, and not just through the mail, but through drop-off boxes, which is something the local election officials in Philadelphia and all of our counties have the authority to do. So this is a more complicated example, and it's another one that's taken place over many years, but it's where we've had to keep our eye on where the decision-making power is at the state level with our legislation passing law, with a state agency in helping provide guidance and interpret that law, which is in that case the Pennsylvania Department of State. And then finally, the local government and our local election officials who actually execute elections. And again, when push comes to shove, when we vote on November 3rd, it's going to be our local officials who largely make this a success or a failure. It's going to be them who determine whether or not we have enough drop-off boxes. Them who make sure that paper applications with postage included gets out to registered voters. It's going to be them who make sure that the thousands of applications that come into their office get accurately and efficiently processed. And so keeping those decision makers in power, keeping in mind those decision makers who have power is been the trick and the challenge throughout this whole process. And the last thing I'll name quickly is, in addition to identifying and keeping an eye on the people who have power, is bringing together other folks who you can help get this job done with. So, with our organization, we're very fortunate to have several full-time staff, and we get to do this for all day, every day to advocate elected officials. This means we have meetings with them. We have several social media accounts and a communications infrastructure, which means we put out testimony and press statements, op-eds. But it also means we have to work with dozens of other organizations who do the same thing. And this is something that the Committee 70 has done a little bit differently over time. There was certainly a period of time, maybe 10, 20 years ago, where we didn't work too closely with a lot of folks. We tried to stay extra independent, and we put out reports, and we really were probably too careful about working with other organizations. But we've, I think, changed this up a good bit differently the past 5 to 7 years, and in a really productive way, where we got to work very collaboratively with other groups. And sometimes these groups are other elections and voting focused organizations, and sometimes they're organizations that have other agendas, but only part of them is elections related. The reason this is effective is because when you're a local or state official, and again, when you have decision making power, if there's only one organization and a few people who are coming to you to speak to you, you may take their thoughts and questions and feedback into consideration, especially if it's good, solid feedback. But to really make big changes, and this is the only way to make big changes, there have to be other people at the table. And this is what's happened with the elections work. So there's a very broad-based coalition in Pennsylvania called the Keystone Votes Coalition, and this is actually made up of some 40 to 45 organizations, and it's staffed by another group called PA Voice, but the Committee 70 is part of it. And it's really been something, actually, and I've learned a lot from watching the other advocates, the other advocate leaders lead this coalition. And one of the takeaways that I've had, and one of the things I think that you'll have to keep in mind as well as you do your organizing and advocacy work, is that it's all about people. Okay, it's all about people, and it's all about relationships, and that means constant phone calls, that means constant texts, that means constant meetings, and constantly keeping in mind each individual and each organization's interests, their questions, their concerns, their agendas. And it's a process of maintenance, just like you have to work to maintain your relationships with your friends and with your family. When you work out there in the real world to advocate for change, you have to maintain these relationships. And for this coalition and others that I've been a part of, this has meant, for example, setting a schedule. We have regular meetings with agenda, and oftentimes we try to ask other folks, hey, what do you want to talk about in a couple of weeks? We have this meeting coming up. Do we want to talk more about the state level? We're going to advocate for this bill or that bill, or do you want to talk more about the county level, right? Because the counties are only have this much time to get ready for the election in November. Maybe because we don't have that much time to get ready for the November election, maybe we want to shift most of the agenda to the local level. But this is something that has to get figured out with the other people you're working with. So, this is whether I'm not sure exactly how the curriculum's coming together this summer. I've seen some of the work on Instagram, which has been awesome. But when you're doing this over the summer or any other point when you're organizing and advocating, whether it's with your individual group and your individual organization, or with other groups or other organizations that will be essential to get the job done. Maintaining those relationships is really what it's all about. Maintaining those relationships with those with whom you're trying to make change, and then also the decision-making authorities with power who you're trying to make a certain decision and to make to do something differently, right? Again, whether it's like changing election law or passing additional school funding, or making healthcare more accessible, or whatever it is. All these issues that we hear about in the news constantly, behind the scenes, often that's where a lot of the work's getting done. So we only have another minute or two, and then I think we're going to dig into questions. But those are the two big examples I wanted to give you. Is that community park in South Philadelphia, where folks who live there and work there got together, and they realized they wanted to see something different, had a different vision for their community. So they built power amongst themselves. And ultimately, no doubt in the next year or two, might take a third, they will have a very, very different park at the end of the day than they did at the beginning. And then, with the work that I do on a regular basis with election reform, it's keeping an eye on the folks in Harrisburg and the laws they pass, and also how those laws are interpreted by a given state agency, and then also at the local level, how those laws get carried out. It probably goes without saying that we are in an exceptional year in American history, and what we've all seen and experienced and felt, especially over the past several weeks, is the reaction to police brutality and the murder of George Floyd. And what the big question there, and certainly what I will challenge you to keep in mind and to work for, is to keep this energy alive, because the protests and the demonstrations have been absolutely remarkable, absolutely massive and historic. A big question, though, will be how much of that energy, how much of those protests, how much of the demonstrations will be translated into changes in public policy. And just like the examples I gave you, it's going to apply in this case as well. We have local authorities. We have tens of thousands of local municipalities and tens of thousands of local police forces. We have our state governments, and then we have our federal government. So one of the particular challenges about police brutality and over policing and changing the way law enforcement and the criminal justice system works in this country will be picking out the right targets at each of those levels. And to make the biggest changes, targets will have to meet. You will have to make changes at the local, state, and federal level, and it will take multiple years. So this is why, I mean, this is what we're seeing right now, where there's an immense amount of pressure on our local elected officials in Philadelphia, and they are feeling it, and they're starting to respond to it. Our mayor, our city council, our police department are making changes right now, and if the pressure keeps up, they will continue to make more changes over the next year, and 2 or 3 and 10 and 20, if this keeps up. In Harrisburg, which is a little bit more challenging, we're starting to see a little bit of progress. But when the decision-making authorities get farther away, frankly, it does become more difficult, right? Because in Harrisburg, folks are coming together from across the state, and someone from North Central Pennsylvania has a very different life experience and a very different perspective on a lot of this stuff from folks who live in Philly. So that's why the work in Harrisburg is often much more challenging. And then in Washington, D.C., it's a whole nother level of challenge, because folks are coming from across the country. So this is, again, it's these same fundamentals, where when you want to see changes made, whether it's a smaller, more local change, or a massive historic change or set of changes, it's all about recognizing where the decision-making power is, to see that change through, right? And this is where the stuff you see in your textbooks, that stuff's real. Those bold vocab terms that show up in the section reviews and the chapter reviews and on the tests, those terms are real. And what's difficult to see often through the bold type in the textbook is the power that's in there. So that, when you see executive, judicial, and legislative words in bold, that's because there's a lot more behind that. And it's power. It's power that's behind it, and I think that's the one major thing we want to take out of this lunchtime chat this afternoon. I know that's a whole lot of stuff in one session, and I just covered a number of different examples, but I figured that's what we'd start with, and I think we'll pause to see if we have any questions on all that. I'm sure we have at least a couple.
Okay, so we do have a few questions. So our first question is, this is from Ms. Carey. How can we find out about the groups who are working on mail-in balloting? Would it be good for us to tell that to youth? And how is mail-in important for young voters? Yeah.
So there are a number of places to look for all these groups. And I think that the first one I have to name is the Keystone Votes Coalition. So if you just Google Keystone Votes, this will come up quickly, or Keystone Votes Coalition. There are 40 or so groups, and a lot of them are based here in Philadelphia. And I'm sure there are a whole bunch. They're probably based pretty close to where you live, and you get roped into one of them. So that's one place to go. The other I might name is this, actually. If mail-in voting or any other election changes that folks on this chat and folks in this group want to see, again, a lot of the decision-making authority for elections right now is actually at the local level with our 3 city commissioners. We have a little bit of an unusual structure in Philadelphia. We have 3 elected city commissioners who oversee elections, but they have a lot of power in how things change, and they can be quite responsive to folks who bring a list of requests or demands to them. So mail-in voting could be one of those, and I'll make sure I name the question about why is mail-in voting important, especially for young folks. I guess I have to acknowledge this at the outset. I think one of the trip-ups we've had with mail-in voting is that the snail mail, hard copy mail, is not something that younger people in particular are that familiar with, right? I mean, very fortunately, the state was able to set up an electronic application system, so basically just an online form where you could apply for a mail-in ballot. So that's easy enough, right? Especially for younger folks, you can get online and do an online application. But if that application hadn't been available, it just would have been all that would have been possible was to download a paper form, fill it out by hand, stick it in an envelope, put a stamp on it with a stamp, and then you have to get that application back to the city. So because that online application is available and it's very easy to fill out, once you do, that ballot gets sent directly to you with postage prepaid. At least this past spring, the postage was prepaid. I think it's an easy enough thing for anyone to do, younger or older. As far as why it's really important, it's this, especially in this year. I mean, COVID-19 is going to be with us through the rest of this year, and it may well come back. come roaring back in the fall in a really dangerous way. And we need to minimize the number of people who are voting in person. And that's whether it's for younger folks or especially for older folks who are more vulnerable to this virus. We need to maximize the number of people in Philadelphia and across the state, but especially in urban areas where so many of us are living close together. Maximize the number of people who are voting by mail. So the one other thing I'll tack on to that is that, because one of the things that at the local level we have power over is the number of drop-off locations we have. And regardless of your age, a lot of people have said that they feel much more comfortable putting their ballot, their completed vote, in a secure drop box instead of putting it in the mail with the U.S. Postal Service. So, to advocate for our elected city commissioners to have not just a handful of drop boxes. They had a whole lot on their plates, and they were only able to set up a few drop-off locations before the spring primary. But for us to have dozens or scores of drop-off locations across the city is something that we and you can advocate for right away. And by right away, I mean right away to our city commissioner. So that's mail-in voting is something that we here can get involved in ASAP.
Thank you so much. And we have a question in the chat from Beth, if you'd like to go ahead and ask that.
It's here, but
We're about tomorrow morning. We're all about the same time.
that would be fine.
I was just wondering, what is the relationship for advocacy, like with Philadelphia and the counties around it? Because there are people who don't vote in Philly. Do they have a leg to stand on when they're voting when they're advocating? Because they care about Philly issues, but they don't vote in Philly to have that kind of influence.
The bots are keeping it tomorrow.
Are you saying like when folks who don't live in Philadelphia are advocating for things and changes in the city of Philadelphia?
Yeah. So how do you coordinate that, or is it best no, just advocate where you live and let other people advocate where they live?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And this happens a lot, right? Sometimes the changes that you want to see and the changes you're advocating for are not where you live and not where you're registered voter. They may be in another jurisdiction. It is perfectly fine to go elsewhere and advocate. The essential piece, though, I know everyone knows what I'm going to say. It all comes down to who lives, who works, and who votes in another place, and that other place where you're doing the advocating. So, for folks who are coming into the city of Philadelphia to advocate for other changes, if they're doing it in collaboration, in very close collaboration with and following the lead of folks who live in Philadelphia, and who would be living under the changes, whether it's changes in law or changes in policy from a given city agency, that works perfectly well. So that's one of the essentials I put out there is if someone's going to go advocate elsewhere, they do to collaborate with and follow the lead of the folks who live in that other jurisdiction. The other fact of the matter is this: local or state officials, they're going to respond to the people who are their constituents and who vote for them. So I can guarantee you that if we could send as many emails or postcards to a state legislator in another part of the state as we wanted, we being folks who live and work in Philadelphia, if the only people they're hearing from are from Philly and not from their district, they're not going to respond. And that's the way the system's set up, where our elected representatives, whether it's our city council members here in Philadelphia or state representatives in Philadelphia, state representatives who live in other parts of Pennsylvania, their job is to respond to constituents within their districts. So, if we are advocating for changes in another part of the state, or if we're advocating for changes statewide, and this is where state level advocacy gets to be more challenging, but it's worth it because that's where big changes can be made. You got to collaborate with folks who live all across the state of Pennsylvania. And folks who live not just in other urban areas, but in rural areas, and sometimes folks who have very, very different partisan or ideological beliefs than we do. And frankly, sometimes some of the most difficult challenges and biggest changes that need to be made, you have to collaborate with a lot of folks that you're not, may not be familiar with, or you may not even be as comfortable, working with on a regular basis. But sometimes, especially in a place like Harrisburg, where there are partisan differences and people are coming from all over the place, that's kind of like a fact of life. And in Washington, D.C., it's very similar. So again, those long-winded answer to that question, but two critical things: make sure you're collaborating with and following the lead of folks who live in the area where the changes are being made and the changes are being advocated for, and then the decision-making powers, the authorities there are going to respond to the people who live there first.
When you talk to high school students, how do you answer someone who says my vote doesn't count and nothing will change?
Yeah, I get this one a lot. This is it's a challenging and and kind of legitimate question, because like if you're talking to like a statistics major who's making, or like an economist who's going to be like, what's if I go to the polling place, or if I cast my mail-in ballot, what's the chance, what's the likelihood that my vote is going to sway an election, and sway an election also that in a way that's going to like actually impact my life. My response to that is always to not think about it in terms of, at least in terms of like individual statistics for you as an individual voter. I think what it really comes down to is making a connection between this personal and private action, casting a ballot, and the community that you're part of. And this is, and we have examples of this. We have examples of communities that have known forever that there's power between that individual action of voting and the power of the community. So, organized labor unions, keyword there being organized, unions understand this. They know that all the union members and their families and their networks, they need to vote, not just as individuals, but as a community to have and to exercise power. Church congregations, many church congregations have also understood this for many years, forever, right? They talk about the importance of voting, not for the individual parishioners, but for the members of the church and the community that the church is a part of as a whole. And there are even neighborhoods in Philadelphia where if you walk through these neighborhoods, when an election's coming up, there are campaign posters everywhere, because everybody on the block has kind of had a sense of, and is part of the culture of voting. So I think that's the challenge, though, when you're speaking to anybody, really, because this question comes up from older folks as well. Sometimes, like, my individual vote may not sway an election, so why bother? I also got to say, like, in the same breath, that elections can be tight. Local, state, and federal elections can be awfully close. At the local election level here in Philadelphia, whether it's like state representatives I've seen, or we elect our judges in the state of Pennsylvania, local judges and state judges, local judges and city council members in the states in Philadelphia, it can come down to a few dozen votes, right? A few dozen votes, which is one city block that sways an election. And it happens at the state and national level as well. And in the 2016 general election, it was a little bit more than 40,000 votes in Pennsylvania that gave our 20 electoral college votes to candidate Trump instead of candidate Hillary Clinton. 40,000 votes in a state of 8 million registered voters. There was a very similar situation down in Florida during the 2000 presidential election, and really it's kind of remarkable how these massive nationwide presidential elections can often have razor thin margins. So whether you're taking into account statistics or something more kind of fundamental and essential, like your connection and your commitment to your community, it absolutely matters to get that ballot in, always.
Thank you so much. We have a question from one of our interns, Cameron. In advocacy, what is more challenging? Creating a relationship among the community, or trying to get the attention from government officials or decision makers?
Yeah, that's a good question. They both come with their own challenges. But the bigger challenge is always getting the attention and the focus of the elected officials. And one of the reasons for that is this: it's not for any insidious reason. It's that elected officials, they have a lot of different issues that are on their plates, right? We have, with our 17 council members and our mayor in Philadelphia, we at the committee of 7, we care very much about elections and voting issues. City council and the mayor have a lot of other stuff to deal with and pay attention to besides elections and voting. And also, frankly, the truth is, like, they have a lot of stuff that almost always is more important than elections and elections and voting, right? They're responsible for law enforcement and for schools and for public health. Elections and voting comes up kind of in fits and starts. And as an elections and voting advocate, we really have to kind of pick our spots, whether it's with local officials or state officials, because they have a lot of other issues and organizers and advocates who are fighting for their attention. So that's one of the biggest challenges. And I think the one thing I'll pin onto that is one of the tricks of being of being an effective organizer and advocate is finding the opportunities. This requires often for something to happen out there in the world that creates a political window. And we see this happen all the time, that there's a school shooting in a given state, and that's what opens up the window at the local and especially at the state level in that state to change what the gun laws are. In Philadelphia, there's there's been a discovery that a lot of our buildings are old, and there may be lead in some of these old buildings. Like, that opens up the window, and folks have to be ready to push through that window to make changes at the local and state level, wherever those changes have to be made. And again, to bring it back to the the example that's rocking the country right now, the murder of one Black man on the street has created an opportunity for the rest of the nation to push through changes that previously had not been possible. So that's a critical thing to keep in mind when you're organizing. I mean, and it's a horrible thing that oftentimes, I mean, these opportunities are created by horrible events, by crisis, by scandal, by a killing or by killings. I mean, but that's sometimes what opens up in the American political system a chance to push through and push. I really mean push change.
Thank you so much. So one of our driving questions this summer is, how can social media affect youth voter registration? So we were hoping that you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about when I was going to bring up this part of it. I mean, one of the most exciting things about organizing and advocacy today is the technology that's available. Right? We've had the invention of the internet, and now these devices that we keep with us at all times, and they've made for remarkable opportunities to push through change and make decision makers make certain decisions and do things differently. And this has happened in other countries where tyrannical autocratic governments have been overthrown because people can organize better with the technology, with these tools. And we're seeing a similar thing, the exact same thing actually here in the United States, where people can organize so much more effectively with this technology. So the thing is, I've found that another kind of essential, all these are kind of fundamental lessons come up over and over again when you do organizing advocacy. The messenger matters. The messenger matters, and the message matters. And when it comes to younger voters, for example, nothing's going to be more powerful than the messenger being another young voter, and for whatever that message is, to be crafted by that younger person. So that's one part of it. And then as far as like how that message is delivered, I mean, that's another thing that, like, I think only you guys are gonna be able to figure that out. And I might add to that because I have tried at times, and sometimes, I can give the example of, like, statistically, an individual vote may not count, but you can have close elections, or you have to have this commitment to your community. I mean, those messages are important as well. But for something that's really going to sink in, and for issues that only you folks understand, and that you guys would be able to explain, I think that's only something y'all can figure out. And one of the remarkable things about these tools is that you can put together a message and from a messenger in a way that's not just confined to those of you who are working together this summer, but you can spread it to hundreds or thousands of people. And that's one of that's again, this is in this 21st century, this is one of the remarkable things that we're experiencing, where people can organize again and advocate in a way that they never could before, because they can connect with a lot of others. So I don't have any special insights into Instagram or TikTok, because I don't even know how TikTok works. Like, this goes to my answer. Like, I don't have all that. I can't tell you. All I know is that you all know these tools, right? And you are you know what it's like to be a young person right now, and you also, like, you know what issues resonate with you. So I mean, and I think that's the exciting thing about what you're doing this summer.
Thank you. We have a question from our intern, Samaya. When you are advocating for changes, should you express your concerns to representatives who share your ideals, or should you try to convince representatives who have opposing beliefs?
Mm, That is a great question. That is a great question. It often comes down to both. And in the United States, we have a two-party system, right? And in at the state level, where a lot of the bigger changes have to be made, we have a Democratic Party and a Republican Party, Democratic representatives and Republican representatives. And the way our system's set up, one party right now, one party who controls a chamber has a tremendous amount of, again, power and decision making authority about what bills move and what bills do not. This is true in Congress, and this is true in any state capital. So right now Republicans control both chambers, the Senate and the House. And this is always meant right now for for almost all of our representatives in Philadelphia are Democrats, for big changes that they want to see in Harrisburg. They've had to work across the aisle, as it said. So that means you do have to go speak to folks who often have a very different set of ideological beliefs. That means they see the world very differently. So they see the world very differently, and they experience the world very differently. And again, if you live in another part of the state, this is something we often don't forget in Philadelphia. I mean, Pennsylvania is forest and farmlands. Pennsylvania is forest and farmlands, and so the world that they live in, and this is actually the really negative and insidious side of the internet and the tools we have. The digital world that we live in as well, the digital world that many of us are in or exposed to in the city of Philadelphia, is completely different. It's completely different from the digital world that folks in a rural community in another part of Pennsylvania are often experiencing. So that creates a challenge. But when power is split, or when a political party that you're not a part of is the one that has the power at a given point in time, it necessitates having to work with them. And that's really the way our system is supposed to work. We're also at a time right now in American history where the parties are more polarized, and I want to make sure it's clear. I'm not saying that it's not that they're more extreme. They're more polarized. Just the way the fillings, iron fillings are like lined up when a magnet gets put over them. To be a Democrat means basically you line up the same way over a whole sort of different issues. The same on the Republican side. Republicans line up the same way on a whole bunch of different issues, and that's a relatively new development within our party system. So it does mean going to speak to folks who have very different beliefs. And the only other thing I'll stress on to that is it's always most effective, at least in my experience, to ask questions and let someone tell you where they're coming from. It is I've never seen it work well where we have debate club over a given issue, and one side, like we're in court, we argue our way to a resolution. At least I've never seen it work that way in partisan politics. It always comes down to asking questions about, why do you think that way? Even if you think the person you're speaking to is absolutely crazy, and that your life experience tells everything about your life tells you something altogether different. Ask them questions about where they're coming from, and sometimes, not always, you can find some amount of common ground to start working off of.
Thank you. So this is another question from Jaylyn, one of our interns. How can we get the attention of government officials to listen to us, especially as teenagers and young adults? How can we get into advocacy?
Yeah, well, that's one of the big questions of the summer, right? I mean, one of the things I tell folks when I'm in classroom talking about the upcoming election, the office on the ballot, and the importance of voting is there's no question, there's absolutely no question if every 18-year-old voted, or if we lowered the voting age to 17 or 16, let's say, and a youth voter turnout was through the roof, that things would work differently. That's just the way our system's set up. An example I'll give in the same vein is politicians, elected officials know that older people vote. In fact, one of the most powerful advocacy organizations in the country is the AARP. The AARP advocates for issues that matter to old folks. So this is why, I mean, this is exactly why you all are doing the work this summer, because if you're able to both increase the number of young people who vote and also increase the number of young people who are able to organize and advocate effectively, that's where we can start to see real changes. And something, something we often forget is that, what, getting people registered to vote matters, getting people out to vote matters. I mean, that's essential, right? But something else that's essential is to advocate and to speak for issues that matter to you between elections, right? We put elected officials in office in positions of power and decision-making authority with our elections, but in between those elections, they need to hear from somebody, right? We're not trying to put them there and then let them, just use their best judgment and whatever they think we were telling them on election day. They are, they're looking for us to tell them what we want to see. And that's where, because the voting age right now is where it is, right? It's 18. So you want to maximize the number of people who are 18 and older who are voting. For all the reasons you all already know about, right? Whether it's school funding or college debt, all sorts of issues, to also increase the number of people ages. And this is where the voting age doesn't matter anymore. 18 and younger, 18 and older, the number of young folks who are able to get themselves organized, build numbers, and then bring a very, very specific set of requests or demands to their local officials is something that all of us can do, right away. And critically, that does not require, it doesn't require being a given age. And also critically, that also means you can, regardless of your age, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, whatever, you can also, when you're organizing, work with other groups that have older people with them, maybe even older people in groups with money, which younger folks often don't have a whole lot of, and organize with them to make certain changes. And we see examples of this in Philly, all the time, but just not in the numbers we want to see. So again, that's exactly why y'all are doing this summer.
Thank you. That was very motivating for all of us as a group. And so I first want to ask if there was anyone who had kind of written down a question and not put it in the chat who wanted to ask a question right now. Feel free to do that. Okay. If not, then we do have, oh, okay, we are running short on time. Are you okay with one more question?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. So this is kind of a question that I think it is also another driving question for us and for our group and motivating young people. So the question is, do we have power that we're not knowing? Yes.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And I think that the power comes from here. You have real life experiences that you understand, and that you know what to communicate about them. But part of what you're doing this summer is refining those skills, right? With again, especially through internet and social media, the way to communicate those issues and the changes you want to make. But increasing the numbers is I think is a big part of the challenge for you, right? You can build up a mighty core, especially again with the time you have over the next several weeks, around the issues you want to work on and the changes you want to see. But the challenge right after that will be, how are you going to get everybody else in the school, or I know you go to different schools, to all your different schools to also get on board. And one of the things that you're going to have to acknowledge in this is that not everybody's going to be involved in the same way and to the same extent, and that's perfectly fine, right? So I assume you all here are going to be super engaged, right? You're doing all this work over the summer. You're figuring out how to use Instagram and TikTok to maximum effect, learning a bit more about government and politics. There's always got to be a core to the organizing, but to really build out the power means expanding the layers. So, can there be another, 100 or 200 or 300 folks who get involved on a volunteering basis, right? And then beyond that, how many more thousands can we tack on? I mean, with any big people-driven change, and this is something I guess if I didn't stress enough or make clear enough over the past hour, this has to be made clear. The biggest changes and the most meaningful changes like happen from the bottom up. They've always happened that way, and they've never come from professional advocates like me who get to do this on a regular basis. They come from real people, from real neighborhoods, organizing together over a period of time to make that change happen. But the challenge is, like, you have to develop a leadership core, and then depending on how big the lift is, maybe a couple of different additional layers on top of that, to be able to lift up then thousands of people. I'll give just one very quick example of that. I mean, around redistricting, right? This is the way political lines are redrawn. Gerrymandering, one of those bold terms in our textbooks, is when politicians draw crooked lines for the sake of making it very easy to win elections. Fair Districts PA is a grassroots organization that's been working on a statewide level for 5 years. For 5 years to try to change this, and they've been effective to getting the issue to a point where we think there's still a chance to make this change. And this has been a very difficult lift. But what they've had to do is they had a core of leaders, and by core, I think it's come down to some of the range of like a dozen people that have really driven a lot of this. But there've also been dozens of other civic leaders around the state who are doing this on a volunteer basis, who have been that additional layer of leadership. And then from that core and that additional layer of dozens or scores of volunteers, they've been able to lift up thousands of people into this issue. So this is largely the way that you would do this as well. Like, you don't have to have 5,000 people right off the bat. What you do need to have, though, is a committed core of activists to get the ball rolling, and to set up an organizing structure, to set up a leadership group, to have meetings, to figure out exactly what changes you want to see, and again, critically, who can actually have decision-making authority to make those changes.
Thank you so much. Would you be okay with us asking one more question?
I would love to hang around for a few minutes. As long as you like. As long as you like.
Okay, so we have 2 questions. If you want, we can read both and you can choose between them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one is from one of our interns, Shamar. He says, is there any way to make the mail-in ballots easier to use? I had connection issues and didn't, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, and then our second question is, our vision brings together 18-year-olds across the line of college and high school, which means across race and income and geography. What are the opportunities you see for coming together?
Mm. So on the mail-in application question first. So a big problem, and there are a lot of problems. There are a lot of challenges with the election we just had, was that the online mail-in application I mentioned was only usable if you had a PIN.ID. And this is because this online, applications, online form was built, pretty quickly by the Department of State for a number of technical reasons that I couldn't fully explain, this afternoon. It was not as simple as they thought it would be to also allow people to include the last 4 digits of a social security number, which is what you can do on a paper mail-in ballot application. You can include either your PIN.ID if you have it, and if you don't have that, you can include the last 4 digits of your social security number. And also, if on the paper application, if you don't have that, then you can include a form of approved ID. But it was a big problem that with this online mail-in application, there were the last 4 of those social security number, that option was not there, which meant thousands and thousands of people across the state, especially young people who don't have PIN.IDs, couldn't use the online form. This was actually a really good example of that decision-making authority and power was not with the General Assembly. It wasn't with our local counties. That was with the Department of State. And this is something that that a lot of the advocates had been working around and pressing on quite hard leading up to the election. It came to pass that getting that fixed was not going to be possible. But the Department of State was trying to get it done. They've promised that it is going to get fixed actually this month, and so it will be done before November. So that's a very good example where the decision-making power was with a state agency, and over a very critical change to allow the last 4 digits of a social security number to be used with an online mail-in ballot application. And there was a lot of pressure brought to bear on this agency to make the change, even though the folks in the agency, like they were working hard and they were trying to get that done. The pressure is being brought first to try to get it done before the primary, and if not before the primary election, to certainly get it done before the November, which it will be. So that's the mail-in application. That might have been the challenge that was mentioned earlier. So the second question was around I guess what are the opportunities when you have a diverse and broad-based and inclusive group of people who are advocating for change? I mean, I guess just to put it simply, I mean the opportunities become all the more greater. With what we've seen over the past several weeks, again in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, what's been striking, one of the things that's been striking, is that the protests have been multiracial and generational. Folks of all ages, folks of all skin colors and creeds and religions. I mean, it's been very different, say, from in the 1960s. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, it was mostly Black folks out there advocating for those changes. Quite different. Today, it's not just Black folks. It's a lot. It's Americans from across the spectrum. So yeah, I think the opportunities there just become greater, and also just make all the more powerful and resonant for those, whether it's the mayor and city council, or for folks in Harrisburg, or for folks in DC. How real the concerns and the problems are, and how urgent is that the changes get made. And I guess that one maybe specific example I'll give off of that is that with the partisan politics we have in this country, Democrats and Republicans usually see things very, very differently. Republicans generally don't see the sorts of police reform changes and law enforcement changes that a lot of the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement is calling for. They generally don't see those things the same way. But there are pretty conservative Republicans in Harrisburg and in DC who are willing to talk about a few things that previously they weren't willing to talk about. And one of the reasons for that is because the outcry has been so wide and so broad and so inclusive. It's not coming from just a few people. It's coming from folks across the country. So that's one of the one of the powerful things about organizing, when it's a broad base of people from all different backgrounds and from all different belief systems and life experiences. That makes the organizing all the more powerful for what you're trying to get done.
Vote that. Vote it. Vote that.